Are there miscarriages of justice? In history, there are many cases where innocent people ended up in prison. Some were framed, others simply didn't have money for a good lawyer. There have also been cases where the jurors didn't care about the details of a case. They just wanted to finish their work and go home. The crime we are about to hear about led to one of the longest-running proven cases of miscarriage of justice in British legal history. The story took place in late 1979 in Southampton, a city in the county of Hampshire in southeast England. A young woman was found dead in her car, and surprisingly, several men who didn't know each other confessed to the crime. Investigators faced the difficult task of figuring out which of these confessions were false and which were genuine. Teresa de Simone was born on June 24, 1957, to Maria and name missing. Her parents separated when Teresa was very young. A few years later, Maria married a second time, a man named Michael Sidoti. The Sidoti family was very religious, and Teresa was raised from an early age according to the canon of the Catholic Church. Teresa grew up as a kind, obedient child, sometimes overly shy and modest. Maria described her daughter as a person who wouldn't hurt a fly. She was accustomed to work from childhood, so it's not surprising that at the age of 22 at the time of the incident, she even had 2 jobs. Teresa worked full-time as an employee in the office of a gas company, and in the evenings she was a bartender at the Tom Tackle pub. The pub was located in the city center on Commercial Road, just 50 meters from the police station and the courthouse. The main train station and the theater were also nearby. Teresa had only taken a job there about a month prior and worked only 2 shifts per week. However, the second job gave her the opportunity to supplement her income. She had recently bought a new Ford Escort for which she had incurred debt and now wanted to pay off these debts as quickly as possible. At the same time, Teresa hoped to make new friends by working in the pub, as her shyness prevented her from meeting people on the street. But here, behind the counter, she came out of her shell and began to interact with the pub's patrons. It was her job to serve drinks to guests and entertain them with conversation so that they would leave the establishment satisfied. On Tuesday, December 4, 1979, Teresa's shift at the pub ended at 11 p.m. The establishment closed for the night, but for her, this night was far from over, as she had plans to do something with her friend Jenny Savage. Jenny had a birthday, and they wanted to go celebrate. When Teresa came out of the pub, her friend was already waiting for her in her car in front of the entrance. The two embraced. Teresa handed over a small gift she had prepared in advance, and they drove in Jenny's car to a nightclub literally 1.5 kilometers from Teresa's workplace. They left the Ford Escort in a private parking lot in front of the establishment. That evening, the friends had a wonderful time, laughing until they dropped and having a lot of fun. Neither of them drank alcohol as they were both driving. They limited themselves to a few soft drinks. In general, they didn't need alcohol. They enjoyed the music and the atmosphere even without it. After dancing to their heart's content, the friends got into the car just before 1 a.m. on the morning of December 5, and Jenny drove Teresa back to the pub where she worked. Her car was in the private parking lot behind the building, where all employees usually parked their cars. They chatted for a while longer before saying goodbye, and Savage drove home. Teresa made her way to her brand new Ford so she could go to bed as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, she didn't make it to her bed that night. The next morning, December 5, Mary woke up very early and immediately looked into her daughter's bedroom. Teresa's bed was empty, indicating that she had not spent the night at home. Although Teresa was already 22 years old, her mother still treated her like a little girl. The woman was upset that her daughter hadn't come home and sent her husband Michael to the pub where Teresa had worked the day before. When Michael reached the pub, he found his stepdaughter's car still parked in the employee parking lot behind the building. He assumed that Teresa had been delayed at work for some reason, so he returned home and informed his wife about the car. Had the man approached the Ford, he would have realized why she hadn't come home that night. At that time, the owner of the pub, a man named Anthony Pocock, was waiting for a delivery from the brewery. The delivery truck was due to arrive at 10 a.m. The man looked at the parking lot to make sure the truck could turn around and noticed the parked Ford belonging to Teresa de Simone. Apparently, the employee had left her car overnight, blocking the delivery truck's entrance. Anthony approached Teresa's car to assess the situation and found that the door was unlocked. The man looked inside and involuntarily flinched when he saw the gruesome sight of the young woman's semi-naked body in the back seat of the Ford. It was 22-year-old Teresa de Simone. She was dead, brutally taken from life in her own car. Anthony ran into the building in a panic, calling for help. After he had recovered a little, he grabbed his phone and called the police to report the incident. The emergency services arriving at the scene suspected that Teresa had been the victim of severe abuse. She was lying in the back seat of the car, one leg bent at the knee, her tights and underwear pulled down and lying on the floor. Her left breast and body below the waist were exposed. Hematomas and lacerations on the genitals indicated that the sexual intercourse was not consensual. A subsequent autopsy confirmed this suspicion. Furthermore, abrasions were found on the victim's neck that visually resembled the imprint of a cross or crucifix. As it later turned out, Teresa de Simone was indeed wearing a cross on a gold chain, even on the night she died. However, when the police investigated the crime scene, they found the pendant neither around her neck nor in her car or nearby in the parking lot. According to the police report, besides the chain and cross, other pieces of jewelry the woman had worn the previous evening were also missing. The Ford's keys and Teresa's wristwatch were also missing, indicating another possible motive: robbery. Near the car, a leather bag and her personal belongings, including her diary, were found. Regarding Teresa de Simone's cause of death, the pathologist concluded, based on the white foamy mucus in the victim's mouth, that her death was the result of a long, slow strangulation using one of the car's seatbelts. That is, the perpetrator used the belt as a weapon. Death occurred sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., so she was abducted after her friend Jenny Savage had already driven away. Apparently, the perpetrator watched the women as they chatted while sitting in the car then. When Jenny drove away and Teresa went to her car, he attacked her in the empty parking lot which was obscured by the building. Hampshire police launched an investigation into the tragic death of Teresa de Simone. While a forensic team examined the car for physical evidence, other officers conducted interviews. They spoke with the deceased's family, her friends, colleagues from the pub and the gas company office, as well as residents who might have noticed something strange that night. Police officers searched the surrounding houses and questioned neighbors. The officers remained in front of the pub, so anyone with information could report directly to them. Investigators also reconstructed Teresa's movements that night. There was a young policewoman in the department who looked a bit like Teresa. She was asked to retrace de Simone's steps from the pub to the disco and back to the pub. All of this was photographed and published with the intention that someone would remember some details in the photos. Teresa's case soon made headlines. The story of the shocking crime was on the front pages of various print media. The more media attention the case received, the more versions emerged from the public. On the one hand, the publication of the case details increased the chance of solving the crime. On the other hand, among the numerous calls and appeals from the public, there were also many false leads. It got to the point where, in addition to the multitude of tips and versions, confessions from several men were added, who literally said that they were the ones who committed the massacre against her. It is not known what purpose these men pursued, but they actually reported themselves to the police. However, in most cases, they did so anonymously by phone. Investigators took each of these reports seriously and checked the identity of the potential suspects to determine if any of them were actually telling the truth. In the end, however, all candidates were gradually ruled out. Most men were excluded by blood tests. Since Teresa had been forced into sexual intercourse, the perpetrator's semen entered the victim's body. They were able to extract it and thus obtain the perpetrator's DNA. A comparative DNA analysis was not yet available in 1979, so the police could not use the material for exact identification of the perpetrator. However, experts analyzed samples of the semen and were able to determine that the perpetrator was a secretor. This is a person who secretes their blood group antigens into bodily fluids such as saliva, mucus, semen, and so on. Forensic scientists were able to determine that the perpetrator had blood group A, rare enough for a secretor. So, taking blood samples from potential offenders, determining who among them is a secretor, and then initiating a thorough investigation, it seemed so simple. However, most male suspects were immediately excluded because their blood type did not match the samples taken from the semen. Over the course of a year, the police interviewed approximately 30,000 people, took 2,500 statements, and checked more than 500 individuals who were in the vicinity on the night Teresa was attacked. However, investigators never managed to link any of them to the crime, and the Teresa de Simone case gradually faded into oblivion. A year later, however, there was another confession to the crime that stood out from all the others. This time, investigators believed the confession might actually be genuine. On December 11, 1980, a 28-year-old man named Sean Hodgson, an inmate at Waxford Prison in southwest London, requested permission to speak with the prison chaplain. Sean Hodgson, also known as Robert Graham Hodgson, was born in 1952 in County Durham in northeast England. He grew up in a large family where parental attention and control were apparently insufficient for all the children, because at the age of 11, Sean was sent to a juvenile detention center for minor offenses. Subsequently, he was convicted of theft, fraud, possession of weapons, and sexual abuse. Sean, however, had no convictions for violent crimes. The reason Hodgson was in prison in late 1980 was car theft. The man was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Coincidentally, on the same night Teresa de Simone was attacked, he had stolen a car in Southampton, and the police had already considered him a suspect in the initial phase of the investigation, but for some reason deemed Hodgson an unsuitable candidate for the role of the madman. In December 1980, Sean Hodgson went to the chapel of Waxford Prison and asked a priest to hear his confession. The man confessed to Father Frank Morin that he was the man responsible for the massacre of Teresa de Simone. Hodgson said he had often been plagued by guilt over what he had done to her. Teresa had appeared to him more than once in dreams and visions, he complained. He couldn't cope with it anymore. Sean Hodgson confessed the crime not only to the priest, but also to a prison guard and a cellmate. The man deeply regretted his act and admitted to having killed her in the pub's parking lot. Unfortunately, Sean was unable to explain why he had done it. When this information reached the investigators working on Teresa's case, they immediately traveled to the prison to speak with the inmate. Hodgson handed them a written confession in which he wrote that after long thought and deliberation, after all the trouble he had caused not only the police but also himself after the mental anguish he had suffered, justice had to be served. Sean was of the opinion that he should be punished for this terrible crime. For the police, however, this was just one of many confessions. They couldn't simply take him at his word. They needed proof that he was telling the truth. When authorities inform the public about unsolved crimes, they often withhold some details. This was also the case here. Investigators questioned Sean Hodgson several times and demanded that he disclose every detail he could remember about the attack on Teresa. This was one of the reasons why other men who claimed to have been involved in the massacre were later ruled out. The information they provided did not match the facts. In Sean's case, it was different. He provided officers with details that had not been previously mentioned in the media. The man knew the position in which the body was found, named Teresa's missing jewelry, and described her clothing. Finally, investigators felt they were on the right track and that Sean Hodgson was the man they had been looking for a year. But the evidence was not yet sufficient. Sean had his blood analyzed, and it turned out that he had the same rare blood type as the perpetrator. Furthermore, the police already knew that Hodgson had been in the same area of Southampton on the night of the attack. Everything fit. Sean was charged with abusing and murdering 22-year-old Teresa de Simone. However, at his trial in early 1982, the incredible happened. Sean completely retracted his statement and said he had lied. Hodgson's defense lawyers argued, based on his confession made a year earlier, that Sean was a pathological liar. In 1978, after several overdoses, Sean had admitted himself to a clinic where specialists diagnosed him with a severe personality disorder and identified him as a liar. The lawyers assured that Sean had only confessed to the attack on Teresa because of his mental problems. In a previous trial for car theft, the man admitted to a variety of minor offenses, although it later turned out that he could not have committed them as he was in custody at the time. Sean also repeatedly invented events that never happened. The defense tried to convince the jury that Sean Hodgson had lied about his involvement in the attack on Teresa due to his mental state. The trial lasted 15 days. The defendant chose neither to testify nor to be cross-examined. He submitted a written statement that he was a pathological liar and that he had not killed Teresa. However, the jury did not believe him. Although Sean could retract his confession, the facts remained. He was near the Tom Tackle pub that night, had multiple previous convictions, and knew details of the crime that only the perpetrator himself could have known. The jury found him guilty. Hodgson was sentenced to life imprisonment. After his conviction, he continued to protest his innocence. Together with his lawyers, he tried to appeal the verdict, but the appeal was rejected, as were all subsequent ones. As a result, Sean remained in prison for years that turned into decades. In the United Kingdom, individuals sentenced to life imprisonment can only apply for parole after a certain period, which averages 14 years. However, systematic claims of innocence by inmates are considered a key indicator of continued recidivism, so parole is usually denied. This is exactly what happened to Hodgson. Sean's health continued to deteriorate behind bars. He fell into a deep depression and was constantly monitored because he sought to voluntarily end his life. He was even admitted to the notorious Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital once because the inmate heard voices in his head. Hodgson was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent about 8 years in Broadmoor before being sent back to Obi prison. Despite his poor mental state throughout his incarceration, Sean Hodgson insisted on his innocence. In 2008, after more than 2.5 decades behind bars, he found hope. While reading the monthly Prisoner's newspaper, he came across an advertisement for a law firm specializing in miscarriages of justice and appeals against wrongful convictions. Sean decided to contact them to prove his innocence. The lawyers agreed to take on his case, and the first priority was to re-examine the evidence. By 2008, forensic science had advanced significantly, and new technologies enabled DNA analysis. However, Teresa de Simone had died in the late 70s, when this technology did not yet exist. The lawyers encountered problems. First, the forensic service informed them that all material evidence in this case had been destroyed years ago. From a legal perspective, the case was considered solved, so there was no reason to preserve the evidence. When the lawyers wanted to speak with the case investigator in 1979 to learn more, it turned out that he had passed away. However, the law firm that had taken on Sean's case did not want to give up. They were firmly convinced that Sean was innocent. So they had to research the details of the attack on Teresa outside the Tom Tackle pub in newspaper articles to find out what had happened that night. Fortunately, they were able to find an archive with closed investigations in the basement of an industrial building. Apparently, it had been forgotten. It took about 4 months to find it. Swabs from Teresa's car, her clothing, and her body were found in a stack of evidence from old cases and immediately sent for re-examination in the hope of obtaining a DNA profile of the assailant. At that point, 29 years after the tragic death, the incredible had happened. The DNA extracted from the vaginal swabs did not match Sean Hodgson's. It turned out that the man had been telling the truth all these years. He had served over a quarter of a century for a crime he did not commit. Naturally, the case immediately went to the Court of Appeal, and his conviction was overturned. On March 18, 2009, 56-year-old Sean Hodgson was released from prison. He had spent 27 years behind bars because he suffered from a mental illness and once confessed to a crime he did not commit. This was one of the most severe miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Sean eventually received a small financial compensation and settled in the house in County Durham where he grew up and spent his childhood. Unfortunately, the police could never find out how Sean knew the details of the incident that had not been published anywhere before. If he wasn't involved in the crime, Hodgson either just guessed the details, and his assumptions surprisingly turned out to be correct, or he found Teresa's body in the car because he had stolen a car in Southampton that night. It is possible that the sight of the deceased Teresa had an effect on the mentally unstable man, and he somehow convinced himself that he had done it. Sean never commented on what really happened, so we are left only with speculation. While many members of the public felt great sympathy for Hodgson, Teresa's family did not share the same feelings. They had no pity for Sean at all, but were angry with him because he had made a false confession that delayed the investigation for years. Now Teresa's family was forced to return to square one. The true perpetrator who had taken Teresa's life remained at large all these years and continued to enjoy life. His conviction was overturned in 2009. The man struggled to adjust to his new life outside after 27 years in prison, but this time was not in vain for him. Sean was diagnosed with schizophrenia and a depressive disorder. During his incarceration, his identity was stolen, which complicated access to insurance benefits. In December 2010, Hodgson was back in prison. He was accused of sexually assaulting a 22-year-old woman with an intellectual disability. Sean was sentenced to 3 years of community service, which he never began as he died in October 2012 at the age of 61 from a chronic lung disease. His years behind bars had taken a toll on his health. As for Teresa, after Hodgson's conviction was overturned, the De Simone case was reopened for investigation. Hampshire police were under great pressure for having sent the wrong man to prison, and now, almost 30 years after the crime, they were forced to track down the true villain who had abused Teresa and taken her life. Frankly, in 1979, investigators did their best with the means and methods available to them. The miscarriage of justice was not due to a corrupt system. Many factors were at play here. Investigators did not simply pick Sean as the culprit for an unsolved crime. After his confession and full knowledge of some case details, investigators truly believed they had the perpetrator before them. The Teresa de Simone case was now officially reopened, as were a large number of unsolved cases committed before 1990. This led to a review of 240 further convictions. The operation was named Iceberg. New detectives participated in the investigation and reviewed old case files to rule out errors or find previously unnoticed clues. Furthermore, one of the police's main tasks at that time was to search a national database for a match with the perpetrator's DNA profile. Unfortunately, the search yielded no results. It is possible that the person who took Teresa's life had never been prosecuted. The investigation team then decided to use the familial DNA method and search for a match among the perpetrator's relatives. After some time, they achieved a breakthrough. A partial DNA match was found with a woman who had previously been arrested for a minor offense. This woman had several brothers, and one of them particularly interested the investigators because his name appeared in Teresa's original case file. The name of this man was David Lace, and like Sean Hodgson, he confessed to the police about the massacre outside the Tom Tackle pub. David Andrew Lace, born as David Andrew Williams, was born on September 2, 1962. He was 17 years old at the time of Teresa de Simone's death. David was one of 6 children. His childhood could not be described as happy. The father of the large family was incredibly cruel, punishing the children with beatings at every provocation. Once, during an argument, the man stabbed his wife 6 times in the abdomen, whereupon he was admitted to a psychiatric institution. Fortunately, the woman survived the attack, but due to health problems, she was unable to care for and raise all 6 children. David came into foster care as a child and received the surname of his new parents. However, the mental problems he had as a child manifested in his youth. David spent many years in medical facilities and correctional institutions. He was described as a loner with an aggressive temperament. At the age of 15, he was first convicted of burglary. Since he was a minor, he was not incarcerated but placed in involuntary foster care until he turned 18. The man committed many crimes in his life and was convicted more than 5 times. David Lace confessed to the massacre of Teresa de Simone in September 1983, more than 3.5 years after her death. At that time, he was in police custody for another offense. He told the officers that on that fateful night of December 4, 1979, he was under compulsory guardianship in Portsmouth. David snuck out of the boarding house, took a backpack and some money from there, and then walked to the neighboring city of Southampton. This took him several hours. Late in the evening, Lace loitered in the parking lot next to Teresa's workplace, considering what he should do. The young man saw Jenny drop Teresa off after the nightclub and drive away. David watched her walk to her car, then went over to the Ford, knocked on the window, and asked what time it was. Originally, he had intended simply to rob de Simone, but then he entered the vehicle, sat next to Teresa in the driver's seat, and locked the doors. After depriving the victim of the chance to escape, he attacked her and then strangled her with the seatbelt. After taking the bag and the jewelry, Lace made his way to the train station where he took a train back to Portsmouth. David had misjudged some of the circumstances, particularly the victim's car and clothing, so the police simply dismissed Lace as another liar. By this time, Sean Hodgson had already received his sentence for the crime, so the confession was filed away. It is important to know that in 1983, neither a blood test was performed on Lace nor was his case handed over to the Attorney General. They simply excluded him as a suspect. Sean's lawyers didn't even know that David Lace existed. According to the police, Lace's confession was one of 7 made since Sean's conviction. In 2009, when the perpetrator's DNA partially matched that of David's sister, the police knew for years that Lace was probably telling the truth and that he was indeed the man who had tragically ended Teresa de Simone's life. However, it took more than just a partial DNA match to close the case. The police needed David himself. The reason his DNA was not in the national database was simple. The database was established in the mid-90s. By that time, Lace was already behind bars. When the police wanted to put David on the wanted list in 2009, it turned out that he was no longer alive. The man chose to leave this world in December 1988 on the anniversary of Teresa's death. In July 1987, David was released from prison and settled in the town of Bricks, and in 1988 he returned to Portsmouth to visit his family. To relatives, he indicated that the reason for his depressed state lay in the past, and family members saw that Lace was struggling with depression. The man soon gave away his belongings and quit his job, and on December 9, his landlord found him dead. The autopsy revealed cuts on his wrists. Lace had previously ingested painkillers and pulled a plastic bag over his head. Death occurred by strangulation, and the medical examiner determined it to be a voluntary death. It also turned out that the investigators were not the only ones to whom David confessed to murdering Teresa. Shortly before his death, he told his sister that he had taken the young woman's life in Southampton and that he could no longer live with the guilt. David Lace tried to punish himself by turning himself in to the police, but they didn't believe him. Thereupon, he decided to end things himself. The investigators working on the unsolved Teresa case in 2009 faced a big problem: how to obtain David's DNA. They tried to get some of his personal belongings from family members that would contain DNA, but the relatives kept neither a comb nor a toothbrush, nothing that could be useful for an analysis. The only solution was to exhume the body. On August 12, 2009, Lace's grave was exhumed and his coffin was brought to the laboratory, where a pathologist extracted DNA samples from his bone marrow and teeth. The tests confirmed that David Lace was the man responsible for the death of Teresa de Simone. The DNA matched perfectly, with a probability of error of 1 in a billion. After almost 3 decades, the case of the attack on Teresa in the pub's parking lot was finally solved thanks to modern technology and the persistence of the police. Only the perpetrator had punished himself. Although he voluntarily ended his life to ease his conscience, the authorities could only inform the de Simone family and the public that they had finally found the true culprit. Teresa's mother, 77-year-old Mary Sidoti, was shocked when she saw the photo of the 17-year-old killer. She couldn't imagine that her daughter's life had been taken by a disturbed teenager. The woman said that the new evidence would truly bring an end to Teresa's tragic death. She hoped it would bring her relief so she could move on. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. That helps a lot with its spread. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care.